It is really great to be here with all of you and with our esteemed panelists here. I'm not going to do too much introduction of them because we have very little time and they each have 14-page resumes, I think. I looked at all of your websites. So I couldn't do them justice in totality. But just to let you know, the map of what we're going to do is that each artist has chosen one project to present in a 5 to 7 minute, hopefully, nugget that gives you a sense of the project as a whole, and with that, a little bit of a sense of their practice if you're not familiar with it. And then we'll segue after that into a Q&A, which hopefully will move fluidly between our new friend, Slido, and questions I have for everyone. First off, I just want to say that this day is wonderfully conceived, but I just want to acknowledge that we're kind of code switching now a little bit and going into a conversation that's more about a kind of formalized and rarefied art world a bit more so than this morning. And just as a white curator who works with different groups and would be talking about projects that involve dozens and dozens of people, and artists here who work with different groups, and some of their collaborators in the audience, some of them are not, that we're all people here who are talking about practices that we most definitely acknowledge involve the participation of hundreds and hundreds of people. But we're going to try and speak for ourselves today while acknowledging that, which is a little bit complicated after this morning's panel, where that is very much a subject. Authorship, agency, race, diversity, all of those things are things that we all think about a lot, that institutions are thinking about a lot. And this conversation is really more focused on artists who are really engaging with those institutions that are more rarefied institutions of power, both in terms of these artists' roles as educators. All of these artists work as professors in higher education and have done so for many years. And also as artists that move between higher, sorry, all of these words are so problematic. And I do not mean to imply any judgment in using them, but for the sake of efficiency, just sort of these rarefied circle of art institutions, right, of which SFMOMA is one and YBCA is one, maybe less rarefied than SFMOMA, but still rarefied. And all of these artists also move very fluidly with all kinds of other organizations and all other kinds of grassroots initiatives, individuals, all of that. So I think there's a lot of code switching that happens with all of us in the kinds of work that we do, and this will probably come up in the project descriptions and in the Q&A. Suzanne probably needs no introduction, but as I mentioned, Suzanne is a professional educator and an artist as well, currently teaching at USC, but having been dean at CCA here, and also the founder of the Center for Art and Public Life at CCA, in addition to having founded one of the first social practice programs in an art school at Otis. As I mentioned, they've all been recognized very much by this larger rarefied art world. Suzanne has received a Guggenheim. She's received NEA grants, numerous other grants and awards in recognition of her work as an educator and as an artist. And her exhibition record spans from her work being in collections in major institutions and working very directly with small-scale groups and individuals across the globe, really. Gregory also has a varied career as an educator and as an artist, someone who also worked as a manager of public art and as the director of visual arts for the State of Arizona Arts Commission. So comes to his work as an artist. And I should mention all of them have formal training. They're MFAs in art. Suzanne also has a PhD in philosophy. Yes. And so bringing to the table this role as an educator, but also as a kind of arts administrator and curator over his years, and worked as a museum educator at ASU, where he subsequently now has exhibited, and now where he's a professor of intermedia and social practice. The terms are so interesting, which we'll talk about after their presentations. And Caleb as well, someone who is now a tenure track professor at Fresno is it Fresno City College? Mm-hmm. Yeah, where he also went to school before going to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also been a founder of many initiatives and organizations, including Edelo, which he will talk about today, right, as part of his project. And he is a professor of sculpture, which I also think is interesting, the ways in which people's disciplines are defined in different ways, and very much identifies as a sculptor too in his practice. So I will turn it over to them. I will try to make sure that you guys stick to your time at least a little bit.
What is our time?
5 to 7 minutes, I think you were told. Good luck. I know that each of you also have a little video to share, so I'll just be monitoring. And I think the clicker is there for you, Suzanne.
Okay, but I want to start by saying I am so thrilled to be here with Caleb. We come from the San Joaquin Valley, and if you haven't lived in California, you might not know that's kind of that's a code. And Gregory and I have known each other for years, and I deeply respect his work. I mean, both of these guys, we've been on panels before, so I'm so thrilled to be on a panel with both of you. So thank you, YBCA, for doing this. I basically want to show you one project which is in Northwest England. I'm going to talk for only about 4 minutes, sorry, and then show you a 3.5 minute
you can have the extra third
video. And this project is in Lancashire, which is north of Manchester, and it's a place that was industrialized by mills and then deindustrialized in the 90s. And probably better for me to do this, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I can see what's going on. And they basically, these mills are derelict now, and people are trying to renovate them. The communities where the Pakistani immigrants came to the mills to work asked to come there in the 60s because they had such textile skills. After the mills closed in the 90s, these communities grew apart. And now there's no common places that they re-inhabit. So we began to work with a group of people, a large group of people, in a small town that's about 45% Pakistani and about 55% white, with some Polish immigrants, a lot of English, and it's a changing culture with growing alienation. If you know anything about things like the Manchester bombing and stuff, that Northwest England is where a lot of radicalism has been created, but also countered by British people being a whole lot more advanced than we are in these issues. So we began by working and saying we want to bring people whose families worked in mills back together again. We want to create an artwork that takes place over a period of, I think it was 2 years organizing and then a year making a film. And we want this artwork to operate between very well situated and engaged in the community and having an equal presence in a museum. And I know that's one of the things that all of us are concerned with. So we began by having dinners. And one of the things I said to my organizers, we can't do tokenism here. I want to see what you can produce. And so we basically, I said, by the time we end, I'd like to see a 500-person event that's 50% Muslim and 50% Pakistani, and which they managed to do, the organizers we were working with. So here we are interviewing former mill workers. This is Mal Malona, who's an anthropologist in England. And here are some of the 75 5-minute interviews that we created. A few of them are on display at SFMOMA. Here's Ralph Bashir and the Building Bridges group that we began to work with, a particular sect of Sufism that was very interested in opening up their chanting and their spiritual practice, and very interested in cross-racial work and cross-religious work. And in this old mill where many of them and their families worked, we formed an event that used the notion of the circle, which is where Sufi chanting takes place. I brought a friend of mine from Kentucky in who's a shape note musician to teach shape note music, which is a very old American form that had some origins in Lancashire, and people sit in a square. Now, both of these are very religious, so of course there were all kinds of things when we taught one form to one and one form to the other. that came up. But the performance event, 2 years into the project, was a week of tours of the mill for local people, and then citing these videos in the space, and then the day of the final day of the performance, having what was essentially and understood by the community was a filmmaking process. And the filmmaking involved sitting in a square and singing, sitting in a circle and chanting, and filming the whole thing. And this is some of the events, filmmakers. And then after that, at the end of the day, we tried to do a kind of fusion, and then we had a dinner, which was quite well attended. A year later, having worked with and taken the film back to the community and back to the editing room and back to the community, we presented this 2-screen projection with the videos, the 70 videos, back in the mill as an installation, and now it's traveled to SFMOMA. Thank you, Lucy and Rudolph. So I'm going to show you quickly, before we go to Gregory, a 3.5-minute video, and I'll let you cue it up. It'll take a second.
I think I'm going to talk from here. And I just want some of our core project collaborators and some of the art and justice interns who are working on this project at Alcatraz right now called Future IDs at Alcatraz. We begin with this image of Kern Kim. He's one of our core project collaborators. Kern went into the system at 16, was tried as an adult, got a mandatory adult sentence, and came out at 35. This is on our trip to Alcatraz in 2017. After much sort of lobbying and moving around, we finally got our first meeting with the National Park Service and the Golden Gate Parks Conservancy. It's amazing that they've agreed to step on as our partner. They gave us a year-long project. It started much earlier than I had anticipated, but they said, hey, how about October? And we said, we'll be there. This is Kern. His intention and community leadership is redefining personal shame and to end silent shame in the Asian community. We'll talk about this later. One of the places, this project began over 5 years ago. I live predominantly in Phoenix, Arizona. I spent a fair amount of time in Los Angeles. And I really wanted to sort of step on board with the reform efforts that were happening in California. And so I became an ally with this group called the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. It's men and women who've been system involved, who've spent time in prison or incarcerated, who've really gotten very good both in supporting each other, but in lobbying and convincing elected officials that rehabilitation is possible. My question and offer to them was, what does that look like visually? We know the power of an individual story. How can that be translated into being able to see 50 stories together? Early on, one of our core project collaborators, Dominic Bell, told this great story about meeting a senator in Sacramento before this juvenile justice bill came up for voting. And Dom knew the guy was really busy, and so he just said, let me just show you something. So he pulled out his old inmate ID, and then he pulled out his university student ID. And he said, that's the difference, that's the different side. And in that moment, the message was communicated, and our group started working together on doing these IDs, and that's what led to the project. So here's Felix with his ID next to Lily's. We came up, we really were looking at like superstructures in the way that individual voices could come forward to be able to build an arts-based public service campaign. The one thing that I kept bringing to the conversation was, if part of the stigma of being reaccepted back into society is a cultural problem, what do cultural solutions look like, and how can we find it together? And they said, okay, this is our intention, this is our assignment. I'm going, hey, I'm a white man who's never been to prison. I'm not comfortable giving out an assignment. And one of our collaborators said, hey, Gregory, you're always telling us to lean into the discomfort. You got to lean into the discomfort. And so off we went. Some of the core team is here with us today. it just was a process. It was a process. We did it in all kinds of ways. We did it in prisons, in communities. We developed a future planning aspect of it. These are just workshops. And then the big thing about it, this Lumumba, he's just out after 41 years at San Quentin. You can tell his was made inside because we pre-folded it so it could be mailed out of the mailroom in a standard envelope. How do they hold up in that big space we got? We got the New Industries building. It's a factory building. It was a laundry building on Alcatraz. 1.6 million visitors come to Alcatraz in a year. When someone can't come to our events because they're still incarcerated, we invite their families. The exhibition is a container. It's a social physical device. And we have had 26 programs to date. Most of them happen on the third Saturday of the month. We co-create these with community groups. This one was part of a program just this past week, and it was called, and Sabrina was part of it with her mom. And it was called The Family Goes to Prison Too. Let's see what we got. I'll go back. That's kind of amazing. A lot of roundtable discussions. We really work with communities to define what's the shape and form of the program, how it will serve them. We got in on this really interesting sort of line of intention that National Parks and Parks Conservancy articulated in their 10-year plan. And that was really thinking about how Alcatraz could be of service to underrepresented communities, communities which that history informed. They do have a designation as an international site of conscience, and we've said we can help you explore that, and we need a couple things from you in return. One of the things that we asked for was up to 203 free community access tickets a month, and that really adds up over a year, that we could give to our community partners to place in hands of people who might not be able to afford to go there. And that when we used our galleries and we did these public programs, that they could be opened or closed to the public. They could be public facing. The thing about being able to make it move beyond that one size fits all visitor tourist experience is to be able to allow those spaces to be used in different ways. This was the Red Power pop-up as part of another program about connecting the layered histories of Alcatraz. This was a really important circle of dialogue, telling one story. Dr. Luis Garcia is one of our core project coordinators as well, and this is Anand Khan. Really interesting roundtable discussion about the role of arts in reintegration in certain systems. And this is Jessica Tully, who was the lead with the Young Women's Freedom Center around a group called Sisters at the Center. And so they asked that their meeting be closed, and that's why you don't have a photograph of them. Oh, but the organizers wanted us to, so we did get the organizer. And we had childcare. And massage. All kinds of different programs where we really activate. We have, it's a multi-purpose room. We recast it all the time based on whatever the group wants. Plays, we've had 3 plays. This is Actors Gang Prison Project. This Kelly, do you want to tell people who you are and what you do? Yeah, real quick.
He could have
You
warned
can
me
use
about
my
that
microphone.
I had that
Speak
photo.
into his chest.
Sweet. My name is Kelly Savage. I have just recently been released after 23 years of incarceration. Thank you, Governor Brown. I have the pleasure in this arena to work in the space for processing within our area. So if it gets heavy, somebody, you're doing a lot of different classes, somebody is in a process of understanding what their families are going through inside. Where do they go and how do they deal with that emotion at that moment? We don't want them to leave that space and go up to the cell block and then be even more traumatized. So we take some time to kind of work with them on the side, which is a gift to be able to communicate with people in that area and that emotional space. So I've got blessed to be able to do that.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, sorry. I want to, sorry. Here we are.
In the community, you have to change first. And this me changing, my friend giving back. Instead of tearing down the community, is to uplift the community and to make a change into the community. If I didn't go through half the shit that I went through as a kid, then I wouldn't be the woman that I am today. And I was raised to be strong and to have a strong backbone. Everything that I've been through in life, it was a lesson taught and a lesson learned, and I do not regret anything that I've been through in life. There was a time in my life where I was on drugs, I'm not gonna lie. I was on drugs and I was out there putting poison into the community. To being an outsider, like, dang, that was me. All right, well, let me make a change. Let me see how can I help this person. Instead of feeding my people poison or feeding the community poison, I started to feed the people food. Thank you.
Wow. And this is our last one. This is you, Sabrina. Will you just talk for a quick minute?
Sure.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Sabrina Reed. I'm one of the core collaborators. I've spent 25 years in and out of prison. I have been out for about 8 years. But I work in the community here in San Francisco in the justice world. And so being a part of this, I'm also an artist, little artist. But being part of this was so huge because it brought the two worlds together in a way that was just, I'm standing here in front of all of you. And inviting all the different community organizations to get out to see this was just, it was easy. But getting them all together in the same room and having the art be the thing.
One of the things that's amazing about Sabrina's ID is that she was asked by the district attorney, George Gascon, to serve on his board for formerly incarcerated individuals. And so she plays...
After being prosecuted by his office.
So, thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a 7-minute video that I'm just going to read through. I'm going to introduce the project Adelo, where the United Nations used to be. It's an artist residency,
Really
experimental art space in Chiapas, Mexico. So I'm going to read a little bit through it so I don't miss key points, and then it's just going to be a huge collage of all kinds of different performances and projects. And then I'm going to talk about the Zapatera Negra project, which united the Black Panther aesthetics with Zapatista aesthetics. So yeah, in the fall of 2009, over 100 displaced indigenous community members occupied the offices of the United Nations located in San Cristobal de las Casas, Chiapas, Mexico. The offices were taken over in hopes of gaining international attention from humanitarian organizations. After a few months of the occupation, the United Nations simply decided to find a new place and moved. A few months later, disillusioned with the linear path of art history and wished to believe that art could be a radical form of communication, we moved into the building and began an experimental art space of intercommunal artist residency of diverse practices. We began to invite artists, activists, cultural workers, inventors, gardeners, PhDs, jugglers, educators to take part in the continuing and creating an experimental of art and social change. This group of artists, disenchanted by the continuing linear path of art history, came to Adelo as in favor of art as a vehicle for possible transformation. Inspired by the 1994 Indigenous Zapatista uprising, where word and poetry are used to inspire a generation to imagine other worlds possible, Adelo has retained the name of the United Nations. It is in part of an investigation of how art and all its disciplines and contradictions can take the supposed role of such institutional bodies in creating understanding, empathy, and to serve as a tool for imagining alternatives to what seems to be a harmful and violent system that we have come to accept. This is one of the projects at Adelo, working with self-taught builders. And so the idea was to bring in gardeners, environmentalists, PhDs, jugglers, artisans. San Cristobal de las Casas is a very interesting little colonial town. And these are just kind of some of the community performances that we've created. And so residents would stay from 3 to 6 months, depending on their projects, depending on their situation. And I'll read a little bit about what this work is trying to achieve. This work locates itself within ancient indigenous and working people's forms of art making and the celebration and contemplation of other forms of knowledge. It dismantles the hierarchies of cultural production while temporarily delinking from Western rationale. It is a return to a traditional understanding of performance as ritual, the object and painting as visual culture for symbolic community understanding, while addressing issues of global migration, human endurance, social mobility, and our capacity to transform moments of tragedy into opportunities for healing. Through workshops, interviews, and intimate conversations, we collectively navigate towards a language that makes sense to us all. It is bold and apologetic, site-specific and surreal in the Latin American tradition, and that it injects magic into a logical moment of uncertainty while liberating itself from the pressures of art history and the demands of creating with newness. So avoiding kind of reproducing artwork and just getting rid of our whole idea of what art production is and kind of just start creating with the level of urgency that certain situations demand. And so this brings us to the residency program. We have the opportunity to make call-outs and make specific invitations. And so one of those invitations, we started looking at what the Black Panther Party's use of the body, public performance, the depiction of the self, the depiction of the black figure. And then what the Zapatistas were doing, using also public intervention, the mask, the mural painting. And so we wanted to combine these two movements, one happening in the U.S. cities and the other one happening in these isolated little villages in Chiapas, Mexico. And I'll read a little bit about that as well. So when I contacted Emory Douglas, former Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, he's here with us now, to come start engaging with Zapatista communities, international artists in our residency. And so it started in 2012 all the way to 2016. We've been engaging with different indigenous communities, and we've been giving lectures and exhibitions in Brazil and Cuba and Canada, United States and Mexico about these two different aesthetic encounters. The artists of the Black Panthers and the Zapatistas were born into a centuries-long struggle against racial capitalism and colonialism, state repression, international war and plunder. Not only did these two movements offer the world an enduring image of freedom and dignified rebellion, they did so with rebellious style, putting culture and aesthetics at the forefront of political life. Zapantera Negra gathered the visual results of encounters beginning 2012 and through 2016. And so a lot of the stuff that we did, we collaborated with women embroidery collectives from Zapatista territory. The Zapatistas still have control of their territory, so to collaborate with them, you have to be invited. It's a long process. So it's not like us artists going in there and proposing something. They're the ones in control of who comes in and who comes out. And so we produced a lot of murals. We lived with Zapatista communities. We worked with the youth, the children. And really the residency was about bringing artists and other folks that are creating change in whatever discipline they're studying to learn from these indigenous knowledge and the use of the body and poetry. There's no line between art and life. Art is kind of part of our evolutionary process that's guided us through our moments of survival as a human species. And so we're really trying to kind of unlearn what I learned in art school by moving out there for 5-6 years. And so these are some of the results of these encounters. Is it repeating itself or?
No.
I don't think so.
Oh. I had a perfect 7 minutes.
Oh, you were reading a little fast, maybe.
I was. And
yeah.
so these are some of the murals that we painted. We worked with Collective Just Seeds from New York, for culture, for Vanna Rodriguez from the Bay Area. And so a lot of networking is involved, a lot of facilitating, and also a lot of giving up of your own aesthetic desires, right? Kind of surrendering that. Also taking care of artists that come in from Europe, the United States, making sure they're respectful and they understand what we're trying to achieve here. And these are some of the ways that we exhibited in galleries and institutions, kind of recreating the experience, being very site-specific to the coldness of a gallery space. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. In my desire to let the artist speak, I forgot to say who I was, which I think is just important to know whenever anyone's speaking with you. So I'm a curator who's worked in between big museums and arts institutions like the Walker, the Carnegie Museum, the Berkeley Art Museum here in the Matrix program, and also working with public arts organizations. I spent a long time working with the Philadelphia Mural Arts in producing for them, which was an interesting step, trying to make more high-profile projects, I guess, for lack of a better word, without losing the kind of core values of their practice. Lucia also served as a guest curator with them, producing projects with them. So apropos to this, one of the last projects I did with them is a multi-year work with Michael Rakowitz, the Iraqi-American artist, and we spent about 4 years, actually, working with the recently resettled Iraqis of Philadelphia and working with warrior writers and the veterans community of Philadelphia to produce a large-scale performance on Independence Mall and also a radio program that was broadcast and exists as a podcast now called Radio Silence. So,
Nice.
So we have questions coming in. I do want to. One of them sort of summarizes a main point of, I think, what we mean to talk about, and we really wanted to talk about kind of the artist's motivation and the artist's role in these projects rather than a kind of institutional role or talking about the exhibitionary nature of projects. And I am very curious to hear you all speak about, given that the kinds of projects that we're talking about have as their subject and as their content the redistribution of power, the attack against power, the idea of dismantling structures that currently exist, whether those be structures of mass incarceration, structures of art world power, structures of inequity, all of these things. So how do you work to make the process and the kind of form of the projects stay true to those ideals and those ethics in terms of the ways in which they themselves work against these normative conventions of power and of inequity that exist in the world? Is everyone going to do this? Anyone can start.
You want to start?
What's the question again? Sorry.
How do you structure the process and the form of the work to live up to the kind of ethics and ideals of the content of the work as a dismantling of power or a challenge to the status quo?
I think for me, after grad school in Chicago, it was just a matter of urgency that I was feeling with the political climate, the sense of hopelessness, and then being inspired by an indigenous movement that acted the absurd of thinking that they can take the military, Mexican military, and the U.S. interest after NAFTA passed the North American Free Trade Agreement. So they marched with carved sticks resembling rifles, and they covered their faces to become visible for the first time after 500 years. And so it was the poetics that can challenge systems of power, and it very did. And so I was very inspired by the theatrics that could really dismantle these powerful global interest, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was just basically learning from those movements rather than me imposing anything.
It's interesting, the kind of things that you bring up. There are two main currents in my work right at the moment. One of them has been this, the body of work around mass incarceration and the criminal justice system. And the other one has been about love as a social political strategy. And not always an easy one to buddy up with and get recognized for, although we've had some good work in that area. But my personal sort of tie into this began 15, 18 years ago because I live in Maricopa County, and the sheriff in my county was Joe Arpaio, who was kind of who was a master at using visual imagery and ongoing street theater and tent city jails in the desert and all kinds of different media stunts to gain power, right? And so it took a year and a half to get my first meeting with him and to start working in his system and then collaborate with him at a certain level on a project that I also brought in Angela Davis to. But it had kind of those bookends, but also in my way and in my belief system, having sort of come from a range of government work or a range of community organizing to really involve the people who are most impacted by that system. But it was just not being okay with what was happening in my town, not being okay with what was happening at my home, and then trying to figure out always the ways in which the museum or the different institutions that I have some agency with could be in service of us coming together as a community and actually talking about these issues, in part because of a loss of spaces of public dialogue that aren't behind a computer screen. But it's, and I guess the only other thing that I would add to that is that deep process-based work. And deep process-based work. And the other word that I'm trying to buddy up to, and I don't know if it's quite right, but network-based work. All the different communities that have to be in the conversation. And if my job is in part about holding space, I do some of my best work as a host. And that's a very interesting thing that is different than the way a society also often articulates the role of the artist, right? And then if you see that your best work is a host, and I think in some ways, maybe that's not quite a good enough word yet, but it's just something I recognize about myself.
You know, there's so many ways to approach that question.
Yeah.
And one is just very, you know, like where I come from and how I got into this kind of work. And I think that we all are, you know, share the fact that we come from certain kinds of positions. I'm a working class person from, as I mentioned, the San Joaquin Valley, which is a serious code about class. It's the Appalachia of the West. And as a woman, I was always concerned with my own lack of power, I thought, but I didn't frame it. So I kind of recast it as issues of race, religion. I was very involved with racism when I was a child, actually, from very young. And, you know, thinking about it, not understanding it, I was quite involved with power inequities in the Holocaust. I was quite aware of lynching and what was going on in the civil rights movement. And so I sort of came from that position, which was also not understanding my own oppression as a woman, except why did the boys get to do that and I didn't? And and then also I think that for working class people, and this is almost never talked about in this country, and I think one of the reasons we have the rise of the people like Trump empowered by people like my people, you know, is that there's a sense of shame that's very deeply embedded in being working class, and it's not something that's talked about much in this country. So coming from that, I mean, you know, Cesar Chavez in the San Joaquin Valley and you know, the lynchings and so on when I was a very young child, those were always informed my thinking that a personal life had to be a life of creating relationality and understanding difference and trying to expand the sense of the self by understanding others and identifying. And of course that leads you very quickly to it's not just a personal thing, it's a structural thing. And so, and that I come out of that era when I wouldn't have gone to college if it wasn't for the California Higher Education Act. And many of us, you probably were the same, Emery, many of us went off to college because, you know, somehow working class got a little foothold, and then they were very sorry afterwards because when artists came out in the late 60s and 70s, they were all like, you know, these activist artists. So I would just say that that's led me to thinking about a discursive form of work that is always about expanding. It's a kind of a common learning platform that's always about expanding my sense of self and others' sense of self and mutually learning. So we could talk more about structure. I just kind of wanted to start there and just to say finally, my code is, my rule of thumb is you always allow others to formulate the content and the direction that you're learning from, the communities you're learning from. The difficulty is that second part, which is the aesthetic production. And I understand that very deeply the sense of aesthetic is a sense of expression of self. And to me, that's the fundamental dilemma of being in the world. You know, there's the self and the other. And how do we reconcile that distinct understanding of the world?
The top voted question right now relates to this in a way, although perhaps in a framing that is somewhat problematic, because the word ego, artist ego, is used instead of the term aesthetic.
I think it's problematic.
Yeah. It's both is and isn't. Yeah. So I do think, you know, as people in the world with subjectivities, right, there is a motivation we hold to do the projects that we do, as much as they may be about listening, as they may be about allowing others to form the content or determine the trajectory, the vectors in which a project is realized. So this question is about how you negotiate the artist's ego, or any ego, I guess I would say, with the larger, and I know Gregory, we talked about this in relationship to the larger needs of an institution or a collaborating agency, or in this case around aesthetics and the final form of a work, or the many final forms of a work. And for you, I think both of those things apply, right? As you've created your own organizations, but also have worked with existing organizations, and also very much identify as a sculptor, right? A maker of objects in your practice. That would take an hour to answer, but any of you can try.
No, yeah, it's for me personally, it's kind of the de-learning of the idea of the male artist, the painter in particular, kind of doing away with that isolated drunk genius, gets to do whatever he wants. It was just the reality of a romantic side of what the artist was in Western culture, and so I flipped that, and so I'd like to think of the story of Narcissus, the Greek mythology, where he fell in love with himself and froze because he couldn't capture his love, right? But there's another version of it. The Persian version is where he falls in love with the image of himself, and he falls deeply so in love that he dives into that love as deeply as he could. He couldn't swim and he drowned. But what happened is that two narcissus flowers came up into the surface of the sea, and they became the eyes of him. And so he was able to see the totality of the world as one, right? And so the act of falling in love with yourself is really the act of falling in love with the world, with the community, and having that deep care and concern for it. And so I think we're still stuck in love for ourselves. We haven't been able to dive a little deeper. And so me working within communities, I find that love, communities that are on the verge of survival, refugee communities, I find that inner self-love that I yearn for. So that there is self-need there the reasons why I do this work is for my own emotional, spiritual well-being, and to make sense of the conditions of the world. So if that is the ego talking, then let's push it a little bit deeper.
And recognize desire too, I think, which is something that oftentimes gets written out of. I think especially when you talk about an institutionalized art practice, desire as it is not reflected in the sense of personal self-expression, like my emotion on a canvas, like Jackson Pollock or someone like that. Desire seems to get disengaged from most of the conversations around social practice, around conceptual art, around the various forms that you all practice.
Right.
Either of you want to tackle the ego?
Yeah, well, I would, I think ego is a good word, and I think you can use it in a variety of ways. You can use it as egotism, and you can also use it as, in a more Freudian sense, the sense of the ego, or some kind of fundamental part of the self that wants to express. So because I look at things relationally, and just to say about structure, when I'm working on something, I get ideas, I sit in circles of people that actually come up with images, and I don't need to manifest my image. But when there's a discrepancy between your image and my image, there's a kind of process of resolution that becomes part of the work. And I think for me, learning, and it was not an easy lesson to learn, but learning over the years where my personal boundary is in art making, where I am going to put my energy, and how how openly I can listen, and that at what point do I say, well, you know, go for it, I'll support you. That's not the image that I see. And for me, it's often around image that does change based on lots of feedback. But I think that there's the part of egotism that sadly does exist a lot in the arts. And it's the white male syndrome, but it's the anybody syndrome. I've seen women of color do the same bloody thing. It's kind of the way I see the world, and what I do is really great, and it's really, it is reality. And it is for that person, I acknowledge that. I also think there's professionalism, and that's a little more complex because there is an art, quote, world, which has all of its problems, and there is kind of moving into and addressing that territory. And a lot of my social practice writing and work has always been directed toward, hey, can we change that world? You know, why don't you look at it different, look at art production? And then I think there's this more subtle sense of ego as the manifestation of the self. And I remember Unique and Monita and Danielle, I don't know if Danielle was there that night, I bet you were, Monita, but when we were working on Roof is on Fire, and this issue came up about cars, and the kids that we were talking, you know, we were sort of, I was with a bunch of producer people, artists, teachers, and so on, and a bunch of young people. That was our 40-person leadership team from Oakland Tech, and were you in that meeting, you guys, where the car metaphor came up?
The documentation.
Oh, okay, so it's been documented. Transparency is key. Transparency and allowing, a lot of my work has the critique of the people I'm working with, because it's not simple, but what came up was the car. And so kids were saying, well, we don't have cars. I said, yeah, okay, so well, where do we go from here? Well, where do you talk? Well, we sit in our bedrooms. So I'm literally thinking, how do you do an artwork in multiple bedrooms across Oakland? And then then I'm thinking, well, what about a bus? And so there was a discussion about conversations going on in bus, and I'm trying to think about, well, and so my dear friend Chris Johnson that I was working with said, well, why don't we, we'll put a bus in the parking lot you're so interested in. And I'm like trying to figure it out, and sort of, can I go there? And it just kind of went on until it got to somebody who wanted to do a graffitied bus in a parking lot on the corner of Oakland, you know, near Oakland Tech. And so I thought about, we literally struggled about this, the young people and the adults, for about 3 weeks. And finally I said, you know, I can't go there, and you can go there. If you want to do it, I just don't quite see it, a bus graffitied in a parking lot. And so in the end, was it you, Medita? It was somebody that said, no, it's Brandy, that said, these adults are just like, they're never going to end. She wants to do cars, let's just do cars and get on with the project. and it turned out that the young people didn't really care about the cars as much as my collaborators did, one way or the other. So, and then in the end, it became a constantly contested. I remember at Unique, and Danielle came up at what, Anise will remember this, we had our first, we brought everybody along the whole time, but we had our first production, outdoor production thing, and the kids were grooving on the cars, but after you know, you guys all came up to it and said, hey, you know, this isn't cutting it. That's in the film as well. This isn't cutting it. You guys gave us all this shit about we were going to be, you know, part of the leaders, and now we're not part of the leaders. You're just telling us to get in the cars like everybody else. And so we worked with that image and transformed that image. And that's what I mean by sort of negotiation.
One more question from the list here, and then we'll take a live question for someone who wants to perform their question. This question, and I think this comes up in a lot of different terms. The term that's been used here is efficacy, which feels like grant-making language to me. But success might be another term to use. How do you think about the success of the project for yourself? But also, how do you think the collaborators you work with think about it for themselves? Or do you have conversations with collaborators about what a successful outcome of a project might be for them? I don't so much care about the institutions right now, just the people.
Can I grab that one? Hey, can you guys grab us in the hall and tell us what you think success on our project would look like? We are right in the middle of that. And it's.
Do you have to write a report? Probably?
No, I don't care about the report. I think one of our goals with my sort of collaborators, and it's that merits something that sort of could merit some unpacking, in part because we have people that have been very committed to the project maybe 3 years ago in a window when they were still trying to reposition themselves in society post-incarceration, and now they got that perfect job that they had been training for, and so we see them at the opening, but they just can't be present at the same level, and that's the kind of thing that happens. That's wonderful. There's lots of different levels of success, and we've been, I think with our work, and I don't know if it's true in the same way for each of you, some of the sources of our money right now, of our resources at this time, really want that evaluation piece. And we have to get in front of them asking for it through the social science model. We're not capitalized, we're not resourced at a level where we can do all that kind of testing. And so it requires us getting in front of it and kind of defining what that kind of evaluation metrics might look like. But there's lots of different communities. One of the roles that Kelly's been playing in the project, which is just amazing, is she's been sending video clips and information actively back inside the institutions that we've been working with. And that's amazing because especially, I think more so for them, but also for the other collaborators in the project who made an ID, those contributors, the validation level of being in the project is just off the chart. It's off the chart, and we also feel it with their families in what it's doing, which is amazing. In that one little area, or one area of the project, there's such a recidivism rate. The recidivism rate is huge, and so the message that always comes is you can't survive on the outside once you've completed. And so our visual imagery, our video clips going back inside, this impact is part of this bigger message that's happening with the reform efforts that California's leading that are really giving people hope who never thought they had a chance. And so I think in that one area, that piece of our audience, that piece of our collaborators is huge. And so, we have this other audience, which are all those visitors to Alcatraz, right? But does that show up in the art world realm? Does that get the level of ripple out in media? It's so interesting to have worked on this with national parks through government shutdown, through squirming, and oh God, it's gonna be taped, I better not. Scrutiny under from Washington, right? Everybody's a little cautious right now, right? And they're our partner, and we really need to do right by them, right? And so, it's a delicate walk. It's a delicate walk, but it also means it's kind of made us step back and do our best creative problem solving on how do we succeed in those spaces that will help the messaging of this project, which was the intent of it, out across the media airwaves. So there's all kinds of different successes that are anchored back into the original goals that the team came up with. I think that's probably enough rambling.
Yeah. Caleb or Suzanne, do you want to answer that one?
Well, success, just recently I saw a post of a school that is implementing Zapantera Negra as a teaching tool to see how art can really transform communities. A lot of the universities or schools we present the project are not very much aware of the Black Panther Party and what kind of programs they developed. The whole image of the Black Panthers is still very, very on the negative side when it comes to what we're teaching our kids in our public school system. So just having Emery present his revolutionary art with Zapatista art and all the different artworks that were produced from different artists, musicians. There was new CDs and songs created about the merger of these two movements, and so I think that's pretty successful.
Suzanne?
Well, I guess I did a lot of writing early on about what made a social practice work successful. And first it was in the early 80s, it was about, did we succeed with measurable results? And I even counted things, like how many times the ERA appeared in the newspaper or something. And then I began to feel like, you know, given the resources we have and the time and energy we have, is that the right criteria by which we should judge our work?
Right.
So I'm left again with sort of this sense of, you know, and I don't think it's only visual. I mean, I recognize in these two projects, to me, they're brilliant projects. They work as art. And I know a lot of other projects that might be just as important to people's lives and just as important in that community, but I wouldn't see them in the same way I see both of these works. And I don't quite know what that is, and people like Shannon, you know, Lucia might, Rudolph, you might know better how to articulate this, but to me there's also a shape, a temporal rhythm, and a quality of relationality. So putting, I mean, I could say like the mill project I showed, you know, they raised almost £1 million, those groups, after I left. Yeah, and everybody would go, wow, and I did that a lot in the 90s. Everybody's like, yeah, wow, right on, you did this and you did that. And I think those are important things, and I think it's certainly not me that raised that money, it's they went out and raised that money. So, you know, the longevity of work is important, but in a sense not my responsibility. I think I have to be responsible to myself for my own aesthetic being fulfilled, and it doesn't have to be visual, it can be a shape, it can be a temporality, and I have to be as satisfied that I have operated as ethically as I know how to operate. And then I also think the proof is the relationship. I hate to say it, but my friendship network and family network is pretty much everybody I've worked with. That is my network, and it's global.
Do we have anyone who'd like to ask a question in the audience? Live. Yes, all the way in the back.
Well, I'm in awe of your
Can you
work.
project a little more, please?
I'm in awe of your work and the scope of it and inspired by it, and I want to know how you get the funding for your work.
Whose work?
Why don't
Funding.
I don't know. I don't care.
Yeah. Where funding comes from. Yeah.
You know, I've been very fortunate in the last 5 years. I've gotten some important grants that Creative Capital Foundation, A Blade of Grass, some funding from my university, Arizona State University, and then most recently, and the thing that really made the huge difference was the Kenneth Rainin Foundation in Oakland. And
But you were midstream on the project before you
oh
got
yeah,
that
we were
money,
down. We
right?
were down to
Yeah.
fumes. and the other thing that's been really, really helpful for the type of practice that I run is artist residencies, Headlands and Montalvo Center for the Arts, because without it I couldn't be in communities at the depth and the time that I need to. So funding and resourcing come in a lot of different shapes and forms, but it does move into those fragile spaces, I think, with some regularity.
I'm funded often by grants. I made and my own money. I've always had a full-time job. I wish I didn't. I would kill myself. I would die to not have a full-time job. I would love to be a full-time artist, but I come from a generation where that wasn't possible if you don't sell products.
Yeah.
Right.
So because of that, I basically work a full-time job and have since I was probably 18. And then I go out and get the money, and when I need to, I put my own money. That's pretty much what I spend my money on.
Yeah, me too.
Well, really, I don't know how I survived for 20 years doing this work.
Because your tenure-track job is recent, right?
It's very recent,
Yeah.
and so now I know why people are so loyal to the system when you get a
As
full-time
problematic
job.
as it is.
So loyal to the system when you have you're being taken care of that way.
Yeah.
No, after grad school, I was like, do I get a studio and pay $1,000 a month in a big city, or can I just move to a cheap place where real vibrant culture is happening? And that was Mexico. Southern Mexico was very affordable. The offices where the UN used to be, it was like $900 a month, and it was 2 stories. It had 6 rooms. We opened up a little coffee shop, a bar, rented some of the spaces to some of our international residents. We traded with other residents that couldn't afford to pitch in. And so it was just a struggle back and forth of how to pay the rent. We had a big party once a month. It's called Pay the Rent Party. And so that's how we managed for 5 years. And it's tough. It's tough. It's not easy.
Yeah. I mean, there are increasing initiatives within larger arts institutions to produce and fund this kind of work as projects, not just as exhibitions after the fact of a project. But that money comes with such baggage.
Right.
So
yeah, that's the thing with
Yeah.
us is that we deliberately decided not to seek institutional funding or validation because we're working with really autonomous indigenous communities that really study where your funding comes from, where
Yeah.
you're representing. And so we decided to do it in an autonomous Zapatista type of space that we knew wasn't going to be self-sustainable. We knew we were going to have to close eventually. We were going to burn out. But that wasn't the goal, is to sustain the project long term. So yeah, it was more urgent than anything.
You know, I think the reason I work, and I haven't had a full-time teaching job. I don't think I entered full-time teaching until I was in my 40s, and at CCA, and then I had to do administration. But I think that for me, one good aspect of that is it keeps me honest. There's just no way I could support myself and most of my money goes into hiring people or into production costs. And so there's no way I could cruise into a community, even with a pickup, and say it was paid for by, the work of these people. Or I ask so much of people, so much of it's volunteer, that I feel like I have to do that as well. So I think that while, but I think the main thing to say to you is you just bloody do the work, one way or the other. And I had students that kept saying that, well, I haven't gotten a grant and therefore I can't do that. I don't know. That's not the culture I came from. It's for me, and I'm not putting it down or saying it's hard. I mean, not hard, but I'm saying that it's pretty much for some of us, that's kind of what our lives are. That's it. It's doing that work.
And the economics of the larger contemporary art industrial complex, let's say, are not kind to people who do not make objects, right? And so even paying oneself as an artist is nearly impossible. And when one wants to also think about formulating projects where the people you're working with get paid, that becomes even more impossible to convince granting agencies of or partners of. The idea that the work of collaborators is labor, right? It's not just a fun thing for someone to do. Because I think that has been the model that social practice, we didn't get to defining terms, but that socially engaged projects have existed on, is the idea that you're doing something for someone by making this project in a context, and therefore it's not considered labor in the same way as a job is considered labor. But I hope that's changing. I mean, I was able, with mural arts, to pay every person $25 an hour, every Iraqi, every vet, for their work on that project, but only because we got a massive grant from Pew.
I was going to say, you got the Pew Foundation where you were
and that's
working.
like only in Philadelphia. There's nothing like that here. Even Rainin doesn't match that, But it's nearly impossible to constitute an equitable project economically. I mean, beyond all the sort of social and political equity you want to create in a project. Yeah. That seems like a sad note to end on.
No, I mean,
so please save us.
Well, no, I was just thinking a whole nother piece of this that sort of dovetails. It's like, what is it? And Caleb, I think you do that a lot. Is you're not just doing the art piece, the community piece, but you're also holding up the institutional piece. You have some capacity, it seems, to really build community, to build organizations, to build businesses, to build initiatives. But it's very different to do a project of this nature, even like with national parks, because they're not a cultural producer, right? Or to do it with than to do it with the museum. And so these are very different spaces around how do we build, and I think what your question also opens up for me, and that's why I wanted to put that on the table, is this about how do we resource a project? And what are all the different facets of resourcing a project? And if you can't, and this is, I think, the student question, is when you're doing and conceptualizing the work, you have to think about it in relationship to whatever the resources might be.
Yeah.
You know,
And what your capacities are. And we're out of time now, but I have 8 pages of questions, and there are many, many more questions here. I think we have a lot to talk about over cocktails, but I do think one thing that didn't come out is the kind of roles that an artist working in this way assumes outside of what one might see as the traditional role of the artist, which becomes the bureaucrat, the fundraiser, the curator, the organizer, and the methodologies that you draw upon outside of an art methodology in terms of being able to make your work possible and in order to create the right kinds of spaces of trust and of collaboration and of listening. So much food for thought. We could be here all day, but I think we all deserve a drink.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone here.